What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. There is a U.S. men's national team World Cup roster to discuss. I was in the press conference with Greg Berhalter until just a couple minutes ago. I had to dip out early to make sure I was prepared for this, but he had some really interesting things to say that I'm going to highlight when discussing this roster. That's going to be the first part of the show. We're going to talk all things U.S. men's national team World Cup roster, and then highlight some of the other developments of this week, primarily in Europe, some interesting things happening in La Liga, Carabao Cup today, and a potential sale of Liverpool. So all of that will be in segment 2. But we start with what we just got 2 hours ago, which is the 26-man squad for the U.S. men's national team for the World Cup. So I'm going to break this down position by position and sprinkle in some of the things Greg Berhalter just mentioned as I go through. Your goalkeepers: Ethan Horvath, Sean Johnson, Matt Turner. I'm going to go in alphabetical order with all of these. Greg Berhalter didn't go as far as to guarantee Matt Turner was the number one. It's also important to remember Matt Turner is coming off of an injury. But he did go as far as saying it would be fair to categorize it as leaning in the direction that Matt Turner is going to be the number one. To me, that means Matt Turner is going to be the number one unless something goes wrong. And when you look at these other two as opposed to Zach Steffen, I really like this decision by Berhalter because you can identify something specific with these two guys outside of just their goalkeeping abilities that I'm not sure you're getting with Zach Steffen. For Ethan Horvath, and Greg Berhalter mentioned this, in a situation where something unexpected happens and he's thrown into a game, he has proven, both for club and country, he is unfazed and you can count on him to be ready at a moment's notice, and he is not only going to be able to show up, he's going to be able to make big plays, like he has done for the U.S. men's national team in that Nations League final. And he also ended up, his situation last season at the club level. He has been thrown into some very high-stress situations and has done well. That is a valuable thing to have at the goalkeeper position in particular, where the plan is not to switch goalkeepers, obviously. You need somebody who you have faith in to be ready, especially as a backup, if something happens to Matt Turner. And Ethan Horvath has proven he is more than capable of and excels in those kind of situations. And then Sean Johnson, it's the leadership aspect and the consistency. He very rarely makes mistakes. He's just rock solid for NYCFC. He's been with this group. And also, this is an incredibly young group that is going for the U.S. Sean Johnson has seen a lot. He's just naturally a good leader. He has that kind of personality. And so he's going to help unify this team. He can provide that veteran perspective that many of the players on the field aren't going to have because they're in their early 20s. So there's that valuable part of it as well. And you look at Zach Steffen, and what you're pointing out with Zach Steffen is the ability to play out of the back, right? What he can do with the ball at his feet. Sometimes that's been good recently, sometimes not so much. He's made plenty of noticeable mistakes, which is something I will continue to point out Matt Turner does not do. Those kind of mistakes that can cost you a World Cup game and can send you home. And he does have that high ceiling of when he's good, he's really good. I still like Turner better from a best case scenario perspective because I really do believe Matt Turner is a world-class shot stopper for all of his other flaws. But you haven't seen good Zach Steffen in a couple of years now. Everything you're seeing about Zach Steffen is bad, whether it's injuries or mistakes he's making. And so when you have two other guys that are getting consistent playing time, that provide something additional, because that's the other part of the back end of this roster is you're probably not going to see the field very much. What can you bring? And Sean Johnson can bring a very, that veteran presence, that experience, the guy who can just fit in seamlessly, and is going to be ready to be, certainly can perform if called upon. And you have that guy who's excelled in high pressure situations, Ethan Horvath. So it makes all the sense in the world to me this went the way it did. You don't have time to get Zach Steffen back into good form. And so it's unfortunate, considering the important role he played getting the U.S. here, but that's just not the situation you're in. So I do really like what Berhalter did at the goalkeeper position. On to defenders, and another one of maybe not a huge surprise because the rumors had started circulating over the past few days, but some interesting names in here nonetheless. Your defenders: Cameron Carter-Vickers, Serginho Dest, Aaron Long, Shaq Moore, Tim Ream, Jedi Robinson, Joe Scally, DeAndre Yedlin, Walker Zimmerman. Of course, missing from this list is Chris Richards, who just announced before this roster came out that he was going to be unavailable through injury. You have to think if Chris Richards is available, he makes this team. However, this is one of the really interesting things Greg Berhalter was talking about. Ahead of that September camp, Greg Berhalter said Tim Ream does not excel. I don't think these were exact words, but something to the effect of Tim Ream does not excel at the things we want our center backs to do. And at that moment, I went, there is no way Tim Ream is making this roster. Today, Greg Berhalter had a completely different tone, which was, I don't need to explain why Tim Ream is here. Tim Ream is playing really well in the best league in the world. And his last cap was September 2nd, 2021. But he's been around, it's not like you need to reintegrate him into the national team setup. He's been doing this for years as a regular contributor. And so the way I interpreted Berhalter's argument was basically, September I wasn't sold, which to a certain extent is fair, that Tim Ream was going to continue doing this. So at that point, it wasn't part of the conversation. But then he continued to play really well. And so all of a sudden, it becomes a much easier decision to put him on this team. I still have a hard time putting those two statements, 2 months apart together, which is why I think Chris Richards' injury ultimately changed this. But you're going to see one of the themes here is form. And to be fair to Greg Berhalter, he said that from the very beginning, and he has been true to his word in that sense, that guys have to be playing well because you don't have a camp to build up to this. You don't have, games. You have got to be ready to go when you land in Qatar because it's a few training sessions and then you're playing. The other thing he mentioned about Tim Ream was, and this I also do think has some validity, you're in a different situation at a World Cup than you are in CONCACAF qualifying. And when the margins are this thin at positions, I have no problem with that being part of the logic. Tim Ream goes up against this kind of competition day in and day out in the Premier League. And every day in training against, Alexander Mitrovic and the other Fulham attackers. Maybe he's not best suited to play, where you're trying to hold the ball high up the field. The other team is giving you the ball because they're less talented than you are. And they're trying to hit you on the counter. That's not Tim Ream's strength. When you can be more of the counter-attacking team and play something closer to the style Fulham does, it makes more sense. And I've said this about the team overall, and it applies to Tim Ream too. I believe this group is much better situated in a World Cup to maximize their potential than they are in CONCACAF qualifying. CONCACAF qualifying is not how to get the best out of these players. They are not built, and it's because of their talents and the way and what they're used to playing, and the way they're used to playing, because most of them play in Europe at this point. They're not built to get kicked around. They are built to go play against the best teams in the world. And so that's what you're going to get to do, and Tim Ream is going to help you do that. So take all of that as you will. I wanted to mention both extremes that Berhalter has used in the past couple months when talking about Tim Ream. The other absence here is Sam Vines. So I'm assuming Joe Scally is your other left back. I was very much on the Sam Vines should be the second left back. You need two left-footed left backs out there. Obviously, Greg Berhalter didn't have that choice because of Sam Vines' injury, so Joe Scally gets that nod. You bring 3 right backs. Reggie Cannon is the one who ultimately gets left off of this roster because it's Shaq Moore, it's DeAndre Yedlin, of course, Serginho Dest. And then your other 3 center backs are exactly who you would expect them to be. So all of a sudden, when you find yourself choosing between Eric Palmer-Brown, Mark McKenzie, and Tim Ream, it's much easier to go out there and say, of course, it was going to be Tim Ream. That is part of the discussion here. On to the midfield. Brendan Aronson, Kellen Acosta, Tyler Adams, Luca De La Torre, Weston McKennie, Yunus Musa, Christian Roldan. No shockers. Luca De La Torre, it's good news that he was able to make this team and should be okay with his injury. He is an important piece of this puzzle for the reasons I laid out when you saw what happened without Yunus Musa, because he is the closest thing they have to Yunus Musa. That ball-carrying midfielder to connect the back to the front without having to pass. Is he what you need to be able to do that against England? Maybe not. That's why Yunus Musa is such an important piece to this team. But from having a guy who can replicate that, having 2 of them, Luca De La Torre is incredibly important, and he was really, really good during qualifying. So it's great to see him be able to get on this roster. And then the last name, probably, if you will, is Christian Roldan. I've been on Christian Roldan's side the entire time on this. He does so many things well that just don't show up in the box score, but he also can contribute. It's not like he's just defensive-minded, right? He's not Tyler Adams. And you can throw him on the wing if you need to. He can play just about everywhere. And so what I ultimately love about this midfield, with Christian Roldan in there, is the diversity that you have. Brendan Aronson's listed in here. I don't think you should read too much into that. Greg Berhalter said, look, we can use him as a midfielder. We can use him as a winger. We're a little bit light in the midfield. I think he's going to play both positions at some point, depending on the situation. But you have, high-pressing, attack-minded, whether it's as a 10 or a winger, guy who creates chaos. You have Kellen Acosta, who gives you some defensive cover, a little bit of the box-to-box ability, and terrific free kicks. He just scored one in the MLS Cup. Tyler Adams, of course, one of the most important players on this team. Your 6, your destroyer, have to have one of those. Just talked about Luca De La Torre, and Yunus Musa falls into that category. I love the balance of that 3 that you expect to start in midfield. Weston McKennie, the technical ability, the box-to-box, the aerial ability, all of kind of the stuff that you don't get from Yunus Musa and you don't get from Tyler Adams. Weston McKennie gives you some of that. And then Christian Roldan gives you, again, some of that technical ability, some creativity, that if there's one criticism of this midfield, it's that for me. You don't have, and this is where I would have given Jordi Mihailovic much more consideration for this very reason. And I am not saying Christian Roldan is Jordi Mihailovic, but Christian Roldan has a little bit of that in him. There have been times where he's played as a midfielder higher up the field, helping in the attack, things like that. He's played on a wing. He can give you something a little bit different. So you've got just about every kind of midfielder outside of a prototypical 10, because I don't view Brendan Aronson as a prototypical 10. But when a situation calls for it, you can kind of attack different ways. And I do really like that, and I really like the addition of Roldan now that he's healthy to this team for that reason. And then finally, the big one, and one of the more surprising ones, the attackers. Your 3. Well, I'll go through all of them, sorry. Jesus Ferreira, Jordan Morris, Christian Pulisic, Gio Reyna, Josh Sargent, Tim Weah, Haji Wright. So your three strikers, Jesus Ferreira, Josh Sargent, Haji Wright. No Jordan Pefok, no Ricardo Pepi. This was another point where Greg Berhalter is interesting that I want to take some time to sort of communicate what he just said. Couple parts of this. One, Greg Berhalter said if this was September and he was picking the roster, Jordan Pefok would have been something close to a lock. And between September and now, Haji Wright has been in better form, and that is absolutely valid. Jordan Pefok has not been lighting up the Bundesliga recently. He had that terrific start to the season. Yes, he's still playing consistently for Union Berlin, but, had that injury, hasn't really been the same since he got back. Not in the best form right now. I said Greg Berhalter was consistent on the form thing, and this is another example. It also goes to a point that I made that I didn't necessarily think was actually the case about that September roster. Where one of the things I said was, I have no issue with Berhalter saying I want the three guys that play a similar game and have a similar profile in this camp because we haven't seen Ricardo Pepi in a long time and I want to give him an opportunity. And what was the other thing Greg Berhalter said? We know exactly what we're getting out of Jordan Pefok. You didn't need Jordan Pefok in that camp. And so I think there was a slight overreaction to that in terms of everybody losing their minds that Jordan Pefok wasn't going to make the roster. And it's why it was important to mention that point because Berhalter said that. He acknowledged part of that was getting Pepi back into a rhythm, getting him some confidence to give him an opportunity. And look what's happened. He's gone back to the Eredivisie and he's been really, really good. And so ultimately this came down to who is putting the ball in the back of the net for that third striker spot. And that's what everybody was asking for, right? And the other part of this is Haji Wright gives you a plan B. And that was my big thing. That's it. It's been made clear you need, especially in those two windows when there was no plan B because the three strikers did mostly the same thing, you need somebody when you have to go play direct. And Haji Wright can do those kind of things. He's much closer to Pefok. And so now you have a guy that fits Berhalter's mold in Jesus Ferreira. Whatever you think about him, he does the things Berhalter wants. And then you've got sort of your completely different style striker in Haji Wright. And then you have Josh Sargent, who is here because of his own form. And another thing Berhalter mentioned that I do, again, find value in talking about setting this team up for the World Cup and the fact that this group of players is more equipped to play in a World Cup than in CONCACAF qualifying, is Josh Sargent sees the kind of guys that are going to be on this Wales team and on this England team consistently playing in England. Now, yes, he is not going up against the English center backs in the championship. But the physicality, the style of play, all of that kind of stuff, it matters in a World Cup. It's so different from CONCACAF. And so that gives him an added boost too. Is he's used to what these games are going to feel like. And he's played in the Premier League. And now he's scoring goals again. He's got, tremendous amount of confidence, and he was supposed to be one of these guys. And he took the long way to get there, but he did end up on this roster, and it's hard to poke holes into why he ended up there. The other really, really interesting decision that seems to have kind of gotten glossed over. I didn't hear Greg Berhalter talk about this. Jordan Morris, no Paul Arriola. Paul Arriola has taken some criticism as just kind of one of those guys that always ends up on the roster and you're not entirely sure what he does. I would argue that is doing him a disservice considering what he contributed in qualifying. Again, not that he's playing all these minutes, not that he's scoring all of these goals, but he did have a really good season for FC Dallas. And he also just does all of the hard work. He's relentless, and there is absolutely a spot on this team for those kind of players. You also have one in Brendan Aronson. And so that's where you start having to make some tough decisions. And you have all your attacking players available for the first time in who knows how long, if ever. Pulisic, Reyna, Weah, Aronson, right? Seemed like at least one of them was always gone. And so those are 4 guys who were going to make this team, assuming they were healthy. Jesus Ferreira was going to make this team, assuming he was healthy. That is 5 attacking players. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. But yeah. And okay, so Aronson's in the midfield, so technically you sort of have an extra one there. That's why I was getting confused, double checking my math. My apologies. So those are 5 guys you know you can use up in the top of the field. So then you start having to make some choices. You obviously need strikers. They were going to bring 3. That was just how this was going to work. So those are 2 more. And all of a sudden you have 1 spot left. And to me, I want that spot going to a guy that I believe can be a difference maker in a game, can give you a decisive moment. You have enough guys who are going to be able to do the pressing and all of the stuff that doesn't show up on the stat sheet. I want the guy who can go beat somebody one-on-one, who can burn a defense, and that is Jordan Morris. Jordan Morris is still one of the best wingers in MLS. No, he didn't reach the levels he once was at. He's, after this injury, but he is still a really, really, really good player. And I like his chances against the highest level of opposition of contributing to goals more than I do Paul Arriola's. And the fact that everybody is healthy means Brendan Aronson is probably going to play some of the role of relentless worker who comes off the bench. Now, maybe he starts all 3 games in the group stage. But at some point, you got to find a way to get, and this is always going to be the big question, right? Reyna, Pulisic, a striker, and those 3 midfielders, theoretically, are all going to start. And then you're talking about defenders and a goalkeeper. So unless Greg Berhalter is planning to do something different with that or start Aronson in midfield every single game, Aronson has the ability to be that guy off the bench, and I love him in that role, which makes Paul Arriola expendable. And again, when you're talking about sort of something different, Jordan Morris has pace to burn. Jordan Morris can get behind the defense and cause problems that way, stretch the field. That's not really what Gio Reyna and Christian Pulisic do. They're capable, but Jordan Morris gives you a different dimension when it comes to pace. So I like it from that aspect as well. I will go to bat for these Seattle Sounders guys making this roster. I really, really like Greg Berhalter's decisions there. And overall, the other point I want to make here, and I guess there are a couple, but feel however you want about Greg Berhalter. I am trying to point out the ways in which he has been consistent, because to his credit, he has said things and actually backed them up. I am still trying to figure out how I feel about the change in tone on Tim Ream. But other than that, right, he was saying things like, we need our strikers to put the ball in the net. Guys who are in good form are going to get on this roster. And what did he say in September? This is not the final roster. And you saw some significant changes, notable changes at least, to that team. And now I had reservations about where this was going, and a lot of those reservations have been calmed by the way Greg Berhalter actually put this roster together. I think it kind of got lost because it's so easy for a manager, a head coach to sit there in September and say the roster's not finalized, and everybody goes kind of, yeah, okay, sure, whatever you say, give those guys some hope. But the way he was talking about the strikers and what he said that Jordan Pefok would have been on this roster in September convinces me that the plan was always to bring somebody different, and that was one of my big issues with September. I came away from that thinking he's going to just bring all of these guys who fit into his system and not anything different. And here we go. We've got Tim Ream on this roster. We've got Haji Wright on this roster. Two different situations because I've expressed my thoughts on and hesitations about the whole Tim Ream thing. But to me, this is the kind of roster I always wanted. Guys who give you something different, who are versatile, who give you a diverse way to approach the game. That you're not locked in if plan A, the high pressing, controlling the ball through the press, getting the ball to your wingers. If all of that doesn't work, like it didn't against Japan, all of a sudden you can bring on Haji Wright in the 60th minute. You can bring on Brendan Aronson to try and improve the press. You can bring on Christian Roldan. You have these different kind of options now. And the second part of this, that is the biggest takeaway, the most important reality of this roster. Injuries were going to be inevitable because players were going to get hurt in late October, early November, that were going to miss this tournament because instead of having, a month and a half to get healthy or whatever it might be, you had 2-3 weeks depending on the situation. It was just the unfortunate reality of how this was going to go. It was it was a when, not an if, and a who, not an if. And where did the injuries end up happening? To your backup left back and your fourth choice center back. This is a completely different conversation if guys like Yunus Musa, Tyler Adams, Christian Pulisic aren't on this roster. This is the closest this U.S. men's national team has been to being healthy for basically the entirety of the qualifying cycle. And that is terrific news and a really, really good sign heading into Qatar. Yeah, there are some, Weston McKennie's still working his way back. Matt Turner has a little bit of an issue. Luca De La Torre has a little bit of an issue. But if they're on the roster, that means Greg Berhalter is confident they're going to be able to play at least some kind of role in this tournament. And so all of a sudden, yes, the backup left back thing does scare me. I would have much preferred Sam Vines to Joe Scally. I also expect that in a perfect situation, neither of those guys were going to see the field. Anthony Robinson, Jedi Robinson, was going to play all of the minutes at left back. So, ideally, his backup is not a big deal. And then, center back. It's awful for Chris Richards. Your heart breaks for him. Hopefully he's on the 2026 roster because he's off to a good start in his career and hopefully he just continues to progress and quite frankly was making a real argument he should be on this roster. The good news is he's going to have another opportunity here. His career is just getting started. But if you're going to lose him, being able to bring in a captain of a Premier League team who's playing well is not the worst thing in the world. However you feel about Tim Ream, whatever shortcomings Tim Ream has, they got positions where they have different options that you feel at least okay about. There is no option B for Tyler Adams, for Yunus Musa, for Christian Pulisic. And so it left some guys that have played an important role in qualifying out of the picture because those guys were the replacements for the guys who are healthy and available and headed to Qatar. So that can't get lost in all of this in terms of the who made it, who didn't. To me, the biggest story coming out of this is this is about as close to full strength and as healthy as you could possibly hope to be. And so now we get to see what this group gets to do without all these caveats about, yeah, this guy was missing, this guy was missing. As of right now, this is an incredibly healthy team, and that's a really good sign. That is all for the breakdown of the U.S. men's national team roster. I'm going to take a quick break, and when I come back, sort of other news and notes and developments from around the world this week. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Now that we have talked about the U.S. men's national team roster, you can find that in the other video if you're watching just the individual segments. I want to touch on some other things that have happened in the world of soccer this week, starting with the series of events that have unfolded in the La Liga. Starting with what happened to Real Madrid. Real Madrid conceded 2 unanswered goals to Rayo Vallecano to start off the week, so they get a loss. Barcelona then plays Osasuna. Robert Lewandowski gets yellow cards in the 11th and 31st minutes, with Barcelona down. Gerard Piqué gets a red card from the bench to round out his incredible career. So he can't play a factor. So you have 2 red cards down to 10 men because one of them came from the bench. Pedri scores in the 49th minute, Rafinha in the 85th to win. So they come back and beat Osasuna 2-1 in a game they played mostly down to 10 men. They've played an extra game than Real Madrid right now, but Barcelona's lead in La Liga is 5 points. In every metric you can think of, any way to evaluate this, Barcelona have been the best, most consistent team in this league. If you've got an argument for Real Madrid, I would love to hear it. Because I can't find one, other than just generally Real Madrid have been better than Barcelona over the past however long. And they're defending, Champions League winners, and I still think they're going to win the league. Those kind of things. But from an actual analytical standpoint, whether it's points, goal difference, all of those kind of things. I'm not even talking about advanced analytics. Just the eye test of what the table tells you. And what the scores tell you. And what the eye test tells you. Is that Barcelona have been better than Real Madrid in La Liga. Now, take that how you want. The Champions League was a disaster. It also came down to 2 games, right? It's not like they, lost every single game they played. It came down to their head-to-heads with Inter. Those didn't go well. It is different than Atletico Madrid, for example, finishing outside of the top 2. I'm not even talking about failing to continue in Europe. just not getting out of a group where they are clearly the best team. That is not the position Barcelona were in. And I said this after El Clasico, where Barcelona played well and just made a couple mistakes. On the road at a game that they, even in a formula to win La Liga, are okay losing. They're still right in this race. And they have looked better and more consistent than Real Madrid. And here we are, and they continued to pick up wins and not let what happened in the Champions League distract them from what happened in La Liga. And now this league is theirs to lose. We've got a long way to go. But at this point, there just aren't holes to poke in what they have done. And this is, again, all of the financial stuff, the Champions League stuff is just, and rightfully so, this is Barcelona's own doing, but is distracting from how good of a job Xavi has done getting this team back to something closer to Barcelona. It was never going to be this immediate recovery. But look at what they have done in La Liga since Xavi got that job. He has done terrific. I just don't really get the argument for otherwise. Considering what he was given and what this has turned into, and now they are, I mean, maybe you don't feel they're La Liga favorites. We've still got plenty of the season to go, but they are in the driver's seat right now. And so I wanted to acknowledge that because there's been a lot of bad with Barcelona, but there's also been some good that should be recognized as well. Quickly on to the Carabao Cup. Not too many results to really dive into here. A couple I want to mention, though. Your high-profile game, Manchester City get 2 second-half goals to beat Chelsea. City were good. Jack Grealish was good. They finally get their goals. Riyad Mahrez scores a nice free kick. It was by no means a first-team City squad. You know, Kevin De Bruyne was on the bench. Erling Haaland was on the bench. So, but it was a good City team just because it's almost impossible for there to be a bad City team because of their depth. Even when you play the backups, they're all really good. Also demonstrated by the goalkeeping performance. Chelsea's struggles continue. They had a couple chances. City were the better team overall, deserved to go through, and they do. That's really all I have to say about that one. And then just some other notable results. A Spurs starting lineup that was actually pretty good got handled by Nottingham Forest. This was not kind of one of those, Nottingham Forest find a couple opportunities, don't create all that much, but score one and then get another on the counter. No. Go look at the stats. And, it wasn't a first team per se for Spurs, but there were an awful lot of good players out there, and they got beat pretty badly. Now, the other part of this, and then Arsenal, I'll throw Arsenal in here too. Mikel Arteta completely rotated his squad for understandable reasons, and they just kind of fell apart after a fine start against Brighton. So now your North London clubs are out of the Carabao Cup. And there's a real argument for these two teams in particular. That's a good thing. I will buy that. I had an Arsenal fan who's a friend of mine text me that of you're trying to limit the amount of games when you are in that kind of position, whether in Spurs' case chasing top four, Arsenal trying to win the Premier League and stay with Manchester City. You're trying to play as few games as possible, especially particularly Arsenal's case. As much as they have improved their depth, it is not Manchester City's, obviously. And so not having to continue to stretch your squad when you know you're going to be hopefully making a deep run at the Europa League, there is a real benefit to exiting this early in the Carabao Cup. The people running the Carabao Cup who don't want to hear people talking and thinking that way, need to find a way to start reducing the amount of games these players are playing, because you got to prioritize something and you got to not prioritize something. And the Carabao Cup is where a lot of teams aren't going to prioritize. And quite frankly, it's not worth the long run unless you actually come away with the trophy. So losing in the quarterfinals or the semifinals or something doesn't do these clubs any good. And it's just going to make it more difficult for them to end up where they want to be, which is top 4, which is competing for European trophies. So maybe I really think this could end up being a good day and a good thing for North London despite the losses. And then also Liverpool, another heavily rotated squad, beat Blackburn Rovers on penalties to go through. So you did have, you saw some of the big 6 exit here, but you also saw some of the big 6 go through. So we will have some big teams in the next round. But the other thing I'll say here, sort of building off of how this could benefit a team in a top 4 race or playing in Europe, where you already have this extended fixture list. Some of these other teams that feel like they have an opportunity this season to win a trophy and play at their best, being able to beat the best when they're at their best. That's the way I'll put it. Your West Hams of the world, potentially your Crystal Palaces, your Brightons, certainly Newcastle, although they've got their eyes on top 4 at this point. This is a really good opportunity to go win a trophy. Manchester City are still there. Manchester City have made a living out of winning this trophy. But if they slip up, all of a sudden, the rest of these teams are pretty vulnerable. And how much is Pep Guardiola going to prioritize this tournament? Now, they might just be able to get through because their depth is so incredible. But this is shaping up nicely for us to have somebody get to that, get to the semifinals, get to the final, and make a run at trying to take a trophy from the Big 6, the way Leicester did in the FA Cup. You just got to get there, and who knows what happens. On any given day, there are teams in this league who can show up and go toe-to-toe with the Big 6. And now that you've got some Big 6 teams out of here, this could end up being a really interesting Carabao Cup, and that would be a good thing as well. It's all right. This is really about context and what you're talking about in terms of what this competition means, especially this season with the World Cup thrown in there too. Where are you in the table? Where are you in terms of European obligations and all that kind of stuff? Do you have the ability to really kind of go for this because you're only playing in the Premier League, or are you also playing in the FA Cup into the late rounds, and you're playing into the late rounds of a European competition, and all your players just went to the World Cup? It's a different conversation for a team like Arsenal or a team like Tottenham than it is for, I'll just throw Crystal Palace out there again. And quite honestly, I don't even remember off the top. I believe Crystal Palace did win today, and I don't know. Honestly, I don't even remember off the top of my head. So if they lost, I apologize. You get my point, though. One of these teams is kind of hanging around mid-table. I was just throwing some examples out there. I didn't memorize all the fixtures today. So if West Ham or Crystal Palace lost, I apologize. But the idea that somebody who has had some success but just can't hang with these clubs over 38 games, this Carabao Cup could be that opportunity to go lift a trophy. And then finally, Liverpool, potentially for sale. This is one of those things I don't like to speculate on too much, but it's incredibly important. It needs to be mentioned. So I'm just going to throw out kind of one thing here. First, before I get to my main point, it should be important to acknowledge that nothing is done. It seems unclear what this actually means in terms of whether Liverpool are getting sold, what portion of Liverpool are getting sold, what this would all look like. If this becomes a complete sale of the club by Fenway Sports Group, I really only see 2 paths it can go down based on the size of the club. One of them is following something similar to the Chelsea route, right? Where you've got an uber rich guy who partners with other uber rich people to have enough money to go buy this club. And Likely these people are from the United States. Doesn't necessarily guarantee that, of course. But in terms of trying to find the money to buy Liverpool and the general trend of Premier League ownership, it's likely this money comes from the United States. So the couple questions then immediately come to mind if it ends up going down this path. What kind of financial firepower are the new owner or owners willing to commit to Liverpool? Is it comparable that allows them to at least keep pace? Are they willing to go spend that extra money that Liverpool fans have been asking for to not just hang with, but to actually build a squad that can, year over year evolve with Manchester City? Because Manchester City can go buy Calvin Phillips, lose him to an injury, and not use him much this season anyway, even if he was healthy, and it's not a big deal. Liverpool don't have that kind of money to just go spend on players they feel like buying. Every move from Liverpool has been strategic. If you get a little bit more money in there, all of a sudden it's a little bit of a different conversation when you're comparing Liverpool to Manchester City. And the second one is from an ownership approach and kind of comparing it to Todd Boehly. What is their connection to this sport? How are they received? And the other side of this, does getting signed, of course, you're replacing Fenway Sports Group, so it's not like this is replacing, traditional English owners. But does getting another fresh set of eyes in there throw out, lead to more ideas like the ones Todd Boehly is throwing out here, and kind of continue to push the envelope toward getting away from some of the things that separate soccer, and specifically English soccer, from other sports? Just a thought that's thrown out there. Evolution is not necessarily bad. There is certainly part of this conversation, though, that is who is pushing that evolution and why are they doing so? And, Liverpool's owners are going to have a say in how all of this evolves over time, whoever that may be. And then the second path is Newcastle. If it goes down this path, of course, first of all, who is it from a background standpoint, from a PR standpoint? And then the questions that come with it. What does it say if yet another one of these high-profile clubs goes sort of outside of your traditional ownership and starts getting involved, gets that other path of ownership that is concerning and most of the time problematic for one reason or another? I'm not trying to throw everybody that could potentially buy Liverpool into the same, group here. But it is a concern. You've seen the concerns expressed with Newcastle. So how does kind of that all play out if it is some kind of, consortium in some way connected to a state? And then the second part of that, if that does happen, how in the world does Jurgen Klopp respond? Jurgen Klopp has made his feelings pretty clear on this, at least in terms of the challenges he sees facing Manchester City because of the realities of City's ownership. That would be a fascinating press conference. And Jurgen Klopp holds an awful lot of sway in Liverpool and at Anfield. So those are the things I just wanted to point out in terms of, there are only so many people in the world who can buy Liverpool. And the final thing I'll land with here, just because there is no guarantee Liverpool gets sold, what you are looking for in an owner, FSG fit pretty perfectly. Now, they have made mistakes. Let's make that very clear. Overall, though, the money, obviously, and the pedigree from owning the Red Sox and winning, understanding what a winning organization looks like, being able to back your manager in a big, big way and understanding how to build something, right? Jurgen Klopp, it took time to build the culture and build the club the way he wanted. And they got rewarded immensely for their patience. And from a recruiting evolution standpoint, again, there are things you can criticize, but how many truly bad signings have you seen Liverpool make? FSG may not spend as much money as Liverpool fans want, but FSG let Mookie Betts walk to the Dodgers. Mo Salah did not go anywhere. They paid Mo Salah. That's worth something. And, buying a Darwin Nunez. And they have continued to invest, again, maybe not at the levels some people want, but there was a lot that was good about what FSG and kind of what FSG offered. And so, if FSG end up parting ways with Liverpool, it's going to be hard, I feel like, to find a better fit from an ownership perspective. Maybe somebody's out there. We'll just have to wait and see. That is all. So I'm going to take another break, and when I come back, it is time for the weekend look ahead as always. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back one more time to the Touchline Talk Show. It is time for the weekend look ahead. The very last one before the World Cup. This weekend is the end for everybody before they get on the planes to head to Qatar. So, real quickly, here we go. England, couple interesting games. Brentford at Manchester City on Saturday. Brentford have been able to spoil some other high-profile teams before. Can they do it against Manchester City? Everton at Bournemouth on Saturday. Highlighted this one because this is becoming a very interesting relegation game. Not that both these teams are going to get relegated or are doomed at this point, but all of a sudden, if somebody loses this game, they're going to be in some trouble. So I wanted to highlight that one because that is very interesting. And then your game of the weekend in the Premier League, Chelsea at Newcastle. Chelsea really struggling at the moment. You don't have your right back, you don't have your left back, and Newcastle are flying. And the more Newcastle just continue to pick up wins, continue to pick up points off the Big Six, the closer they get to locking down one of those Champions League spots and making it really, really stressful for Spurs, Chelsea, United, and Liverpool, all potentially fighting for one spot. So it's early, but these games, the way that this is going and the form everybody else is in compared to Newcastle, if Newcastle can get all 3 points at home, they are in really, really good shape heading into the World Cup. Spain, not going to go through the whole list. It is Copa del Rey weekend, so feel free to go find out which teams you are most interested in, who they're playing. But no La Liga. It is Copa del Rey for Spain. Italy, Udinese at Napoli on Saturday. Napoli are really in danger of running away with this league. They've got a nice cushion. They can build on it at home. Inter Milan at Atalanta on Sunday. This is, again, top four implications. Can anybody hang with Napoli implications? Really interesting matchup there. And then your other one, Lazio at Juventus. Juventus, for everything that went wrong in the Champions League and was going wrong in Serie A, have really turned things around. And Lazio, you're coming off of this weird week. What can you do? Again, both these teams right there in that top four conversation. A win for Juventus would really cement them and cement their recovery from an awful start to the season. Because, quite frankly, nobody has, outside of Napoli, done a lot to punish the teams who started slowly, whether that's Inter, whether that's Juve. It's still there if you can put a run together, and Juventus have. Germany, Borussia Dortmund at Borussia Mönchengladbach on Friday. Dortmund trying to hang in there. One of the things I've been saying about this title race, I was insistent Dortmund had a shot, but that's because Dortmund were hanging with Bayern Munich, and that's not really happening anymore. Bayern opened the door, and Dortmund couldn't walk through it quite enough, and now Bayern are trying to shut that door. Speaking of Bayern, at Schalke on Saturday, they are absolutely flying. Expect them to have no troubles there. And then Union Berlin at Freiburg on Sunday. If both these teams drop points, Bayern's job gets that much easier, and both of them trying to get to the Champions League. That is your most interesting game in the Bundesliga. And then France, Auxerre at PSG, and then Marseille at Monaco, two teams, again, battling for top four. Hasn't exactly gone to plan this season, but it's still there for the taking, which team can take advantage. That is all for the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. And next week, World Cup preview time. Really looking forward to that. But that is all for today. I'll see you next time.